Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about ranged units and lethality for those units in Total War Pharaoh Dynasties, because there has been a good amount of discussion, criticism against Dynasties because ranged lethality is apparently too powerful. Now, I'm not really sure where this is coming from. As someone who has played a good amount of Troy, someone who's played a decent amount of Pharaoh, someone who's played a decent amount of Dynasties, I can tell you that yes, ranged units do have the capability of doing very significant damage in the proper situation. But at the same time, ranged units, even if you give them a significant amount of ammunition through campaign customization, as I have done here in this Tostra campaign, they do have limitations. And if you're dealing with a lot of ranged units, you gotta deal with those limitations, and you got to play around those particular limitations. Over here, I'm going to be able to inflict a lot of damage very, very quickly, but at the same time, I am also going to have to deal with certain concerns. Now, for the record, based on the polling that I've done, the vast majority of people, overwhelmingly so, are fine, for the most part, with the way lethality works. Sure, a lot of people do believe it should be rebalanced, but there's only a handful of people that do believe that it's too overpowered with respect to range units. The problem is, of course, that those kind of people that complain, they do tend to be vocal. And I think there's also something else going on over here. With a lot of historical games, and certainly Pharaoh Dynasties has attracted a lot of historical gamers, there's always people complaining, oh, this is too fast, it should be slower. Personally, I don't care, and I don't think you should care. I think what's really important about battles or gameplay in a game is not really the speed, because if you want to play the intern button simulator or the spend 30 minutes playing a battle where nothing happens and you have no decision, fair enough, but for the most part, games should be active. So if there are dynamic battles in a game, if there's decisions to be made about positioning, about tactics, fair enough. It doesn't matter what length it has. It can be very long, sure. But I don't really see a problem with battles being very fast. It depends on the kind of decisions you have. And one of the problems in a lot of Total War games, and I do specifically mean the historical ones, is that you may have a lot of battles where there's really, really not much to do. So that is my perspective on that. I could say more on the subject, but let me be blunt on this. Creative Assembly should not listen to these people, because they're the kind of people who, they don't care about how a game should be to be great. They care about having a game in their own specific way, regardless of whether or not that's good or bad. Like, slow battles can be very interesting. I think of like Ultimate General Civil War, for instance, where battles could be very slow, but you always had things to worry about, positioning of troops. Like the actual combat, like the clashing of units in that particular game, It could happen very fast, but the actual battles were long because you were spending so much time, positioning, repositioning, worrying about supplying units, all that kind of stuff. That's not really the case in Total War. So, okay, let's talk about range units. How are they actually in the game? Well, in Troy, there were certainly some range units, or a good amount of range units, in particular archers, that could do a significant amount of damage. Slingers lack the ability of really hurting a lot of units, especially the more armor those units have. Whereas skirmishers, they can do damage, but only if you have good line of sight. So archers generally, from a real perspective, tend to do the most overall damage in a battle. But, there's a but. One, they're not necessarily going to do so great against heavily armored units. And two, because of the way that they balance things, in particular in Pharaoh and Dynasties, a lot of archers do actually lack ammunition. And this goes as well for javelins. Like, javelins have like 50% lethality. That sounds amazing, right? They can obliterate units if you get the hits in. Ignoring the problem of getting those hits in to begin with, getting into a position where you can flank the enemy, do that damage. But you're going to run out of ammo so very, very quickly. And even archers, like, this is medium ammo. Like, it's not the highest level, but it is better than default. So it is an increased level of ammo compared to the game. And by the time this particular battle is over, the ammo, a lot of it, will be depleted very, very quickly. In fact, when you're playing Pharaoh Dynasties, one of the things that I'm reaching a conclusion of is like, you actually want to play a lot of battles where you may want to stop your archers from shooting because you want to be tactical with how they're shooting. So if you get them in a good position, if the AI makes mistakes, then yes, they can obliterate and do a lot of damage, as they are doing here. But what if I told you that it took me 3 attempts to actually win this battle in this way, and knowing what the AI was going to do, that they were going to sally out, so I was going to lay a trap for them. And even then, like, if the AI had made a couple of better decisions, if they had not lost literally all of their generals as quickly as they were here, the AI could have actually won the battle. Because that is the thing about ranged units. Once they get engaged in melee, it's kind of game over. It is the question of engaging in melee. Sure, if the AI or you charge into a ranged unit and an archer unit in directly head on, and you're charging a line of archers, you're going to get your units obliterated, your cavalry and chariots in particular. But if you're careful, or if the AI makes some better decisions, that's not quite going to happen. A great example of this situation is this battle right here, where I am so heavily outnumbered, and there is a storm happening. Same army, more or less, same campaign, customized campaign, just to show Tostrit's campaign over here. But I am outnumbered like 50 units against 20. And this is, by the way, a thing that's kind of worth pointing out. Why I emphasize so heavily that good melee units are important for your campaign success. Because range can be countered, even by the AI. And we can talk about that, the AI, in just a moment, and some of the mistakes it makes. Because there's a lot of mistakes that the AI makes that do end up hurting it. And there's also certain design decisions that CA Sophia made with respect to campaign resources that do hurt AI in quite a significant fashion. But here's the thing to understand. Based on terrain, based on weather, like the weather over here is really going to nullify the power of my archers. And on top of that, my archers are tier 3 units. Like, this is a tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 army. Like, there's maybe some tier 2 units here, but the vast majority of them, like, I think like maybe 1 or 2 tier 2 units. But the vast majority of the units you're seeing here are higher tier units than enemy. But I'm so heavily outnumbered that I will not actually win this battle. Because the enemy is just going to keep getting reinforcements. And this isn't a situation. Better units, the enemy has slingers, they can do some damage, but they're not really going to do a lot of damage against my shield wall over here. Problem is that my guys are going to run out of ammo by the end of this battle, and I am going to have to either retreat. I can retreat in this situation. Maybe it should have been the decision I made, as opposed to trying to fight it to the end. But all the same, like, there are obviously things to consider with respect to that. You may encounter battles in a campaign where you obliterate the enemy, and you might think, oh, that's a balance problem. I'm sorry, if you're going against a tier 1 army like this, with like tier 3 units, and they're not overwhelmingly outnumbering you, then yeah, you're gonna obliterate it. The problem that's always been the case in both Troy and Pharaoh is the fact, what happens when you're fighting outnumbered? Because believe it or not, the vast majority of battles in Total War, the ones that matter at least, are battles where we're gonna be fighting outnumbered. Because you are going to be, let's say you're taking a settlement. Well, there might be a full army in that settlement, but then you have to deal with a settlement garrison, and because of the way sieges work, you're going to have to build siege equipment. In this case, I was laying siege to a settlement. I could have easily captured it, but they sent reinforcements. That is a problem. And that's just a field battle situation. Let's not even talk about the line of sight issue we have in minor settlement battle, the walls giving protections. Like, the AI is actually quite clever in trying to protect its units. Like, it's not going to do the same thing that the AI does in Warhammer 3 in sieges, where they're just going to send their units one after another to get killed by masses of ranged units. And you will not win so easily. Whereas if you have a full melee army, you can win. So are archers overpowered, or are they fine? Well, it's a mixed bag from my perspective. I would dare say that they're not overpowered at all. Yes, there are situations where they can do some heavy damage, especially against lower tier crap that the AI may throw against you. But the problem is always going to be, when you encounter a serious opponent that may have, more troops than you, even if similar numbers, you're going to have a lot more power with a full, good melee army, especially if they have high levels of armor. And say, for instance, they are axemen especially. Because once your range units will only be as useful as long as you have ammo. Once the ammo is expiring, that's it. Game over. It's done. That's it. GG, well played. Game over. You're not really going to have a lot of flexibility after that in battle. You could talk about mixed armies. I would dare say you're probably better off making armies that are predominantly of melee units with some range units in support. Or at the very least, have like 60 or if not 70% of your armies made up of melee units and cavalry, to be sure. Though it depends on the faction you're playing. In some cases, you don't have that flexibility. If you're playing Amon Mess, clearly you do want to have more range units than you want to have a bigger ratio of range units because you have some of the best range units in the game, and you don't have the best infantry available to you either. But even then, there's an argument to be made about, like, you know, getting access to Upper Egyptian native units and recruiting a bunch of those, as opposed to recruiting a bunch of archers. It probably would have been better for the sake of this particular campaign had I actually done that. Like a couple of Tosrit's unique range units, the Upper Egyptian archers that are her own unique unit, that are decent in melee. Like, these archers actually, they're not the best in range, but they're actually some of the better archers in melee over here. But yeah, they can do a lot of damage. But once they run out of ammo, GG, well played, your options are limited, and that is the problem. And you can also do this against the AI. You can make the AI waste its ammunition. Now, there are clearly problems in Pharaoh in terms of the matchups, but the problem with the matchups is a question of like what the AI is recruiting. This entire army that I'm facing, this massive horde of units, they're basically tier 1 units. A lot of them, to be sure, but the AI is not really recruiting quality. It's recruiting a bunch of crap tier armies. Well, guess what happens when you bring a bunch of higher tier units against the crap army? You're going to obliterate it, unless you're vastly outnumbered, as is the case over here. So that is a problem. Also, we got to talk about how the AI handles its generals, because the AI is not really great at leveling its generals up in a lot of ways, if they're leveling them at all. So, like all of the generals that I'm facing here, they're very, very low tier. You can say that the AI is not doing enough to level its generals up. It has low tier armies, so yeah, of course you're going to have an advantage as a player, but you're going to have a bigger advantage if you bring a bunch of melee units. On top of that, there's another benefit to be said about a melee-focused army as opposed to a range-focused army. A melee-focused army, from my experience, does have a better R-resolve result than a range-focused one, and that is no joke. And I'm not even talking here about, like, you know, heavy infantry. Like, even if you're, say, playing Seti, who has a bunch of crap light tier units, you're actually going to end up having a much better R-resolve if you go full-on melee as opposed to going full-on archers. That is certainly the case. So, range units are powerful in a certain context. Now, you might think, oh, you're just routing a lot of the enemies. Again, like, the AI does love to get its generals killed. Maybe there is a discussion to be had about how easy it is for range units to kill generals, not necessarily with infantry. And it's like, in this case, it's just a mistake of the AI sending its general in there. I certainly wouldn't. Like, that's a surefire way of getting a general killed, even if it was just a massive melee unit. But the problem is, like, the AI will just use its chariots poorly, will get them killed, and if their generals are on chariots, yeah, guess what's going to happen? Those generals are going to die, and if you have the significant morale penalty, which I certainly have enabled for this campaign, then the entire army will start routing very, very quickly and very easily. So it is a concern. But, you know, as you can see, I've already spent a significant portion of my ammunition over here, and as I said, like, eventually I will lose this battle, because I might rout a significant portion of it. I'll certainly punch way above my weight, but there's still the garrison in this element to deal with, and another reinforcement army on top of that. So, yeah, this is not going to end up being pleasant for me. 4 generals, but a lot more troops overall than the previous battle I did show. So that's what I would say about range lethality. But here's an interesting thing. Lethality did not necessarily make range units more deadly. Like, in a specific context, like if you could target light units with low armor, you could do a lot of damage in Troy, let alone Pharaoh. Like, it was the case in Troy. Like, facing Paris was a freaking nightmare in a campaign if you didn't have an army that could survive his masses of archers. So it's not. So it might be a discussion about, like, how range units perform in general that it would be worth having, as opposed to just a lethality discussion, in the sense that what CA Sophia decided to do is like range units do a lot of damage very quickly but run out of ammo quickly. Maybe it would be a better discussion for them to have more ammo inherently but just do less damage. Lethality is not necessarily, from my perspective, the problem here, if there is a problem. Because them doing a lot of damage in certain situations, again, lots of ways to counter it, but them doing a lot of damage in certain situations has been the case ever since Troy came out. That is all I had to say. Let me know what you guys think about all of this, what you'd like to see change. But just keep in mind, if you think that there is a balance issue in the game, you might want to consider that the problem with balancing is not necessarily just down to lethality. Like, don't get me wrong, I do think, like, lethality is a great idea. It works well in practice in a lot of ways, but certainly it could use some rebalancing. I would certainly like to see higher tier units having more lethality and lower tier units having lower lethality, because just having all units of the same tier, if they're a particular type, having the exact same lethality is a bit ridiculous from my point of view. Just a perspective on that. That would be my perspective on it. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.